I'm in the glorious St James Park in London. Not here to talk about London, but for the first time I had a chance to talk about the Global Impact Investor Network Conference in Paris last week, which exceeded my expectations for a number of reasons. One, it was incredibly well attended, but also much better attended from the private sector investment market than I had expected. A couple of brief takeouts from the conference. One, momentum in impact investing has increased significantly over the last few years and now starting to become mainstream. One of the biggest problems, however, that the sector has is the definition of what defines impact. The branding of the SDGs by the UN has been a very effective tool to bring this to light and have a common understanding of what one needs to achieve in order to meet impact objectives or to meet the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. What hasn't happened in the investment world, however, is a consistently applied methodology to determine whether a particular investment or a particular application of funds has in fact met the requirements, which can say two things. One, that it's new money that's being applied to meeting the SDGs, and secondly, that that money has been correctly applied or applied in a way that would not have been applied in the absence of normal baseline investment in the sectors that might be associated with the SDGs. So this is one area that both the UN and a lot of the private sector players are now working on. This has been done quite effectively in the green investment space over the last few years, but the SDGs are much wider, more diverse and more difficult methodology undertaking for measurement in investment. So this is something that has taken a lot of conversation at the conference and is going to make or keep a lot of people busy in trying to determine what are common standards for doing this over the next few years. The other takeouts are that there are lots of funds now raising investments in impact, much more. It's become much more competitive. The large portion of investors at the conference were DFI, development finance institutions and foundations, and a small representation by institutional investors, but the institutional investors are few and far between, relatively thin on the ground if you look at the total amount of capital that they've got to apply. One, I suppose, historically, they are conservative investors, institutional investors, and by that I mean pension funds, banks, insurance companies. And secondly, they have regulations, very strict regulations in terms of the types of return and the mandates that their trustees give them in order to invest their funds. There is an increase in the amount of investment going into listed equities, which has a couple of problems. There is a case to be made that investments in the listed equity space or listed fixed income space that are determined to be impact investments don't represent new money. For every share or bond that's bought under an impact investment mandate, that share or bond is sold by someone else. So that doesn't represent new money. It might well represent pressure on the investment market to start investing in more impactful investments, but in the short term doesn't represent any new investment going into the sector. So it doesn't represent necessarily a greater or more rapid meeting of the SDG objectives. The other things to take out from the market is this was largely represented by developed world fund managers and fund investors. And one of the areas that needs to be developed is in the developing markets, where new investment is needed to meet some of the economic and human issues which talk to the SDGs, that local fund management capability needs to be created. It's very difficult to raise funds for local fund managers who don't have expertise in managing and investing funds. And this is one area which needs some work. For me in the conference was the extent to which American players were represented and the extent to which the American foundations and luminaries in the American market have defined the narrative in impact investing, and to a great extent have stolen a march over the European DFIs in terms of determining methodologies and approaches to the impact investment market. I think there's a lot of work to be done in Europe to catch up from an institutional point of view. But as far as the European DFIs are concerned, they were well represented, and there is a common movement and common understanding that funds should be receiving a great amount of allocation if they can prove that they meet the impact objective of the SDGs. They are limited, of course, by their thematic areas, the DFIs, but we will see increasingly that impact per se across a number of SDGs will define thematic areas in future rather than the historical determinations, which were things like broad infrastructure and green investment in the past. The other thing we noticed, possibly because it was a European and I suppose American focus conference, there was very little representation from Asia. So for Asian-based UN agencies, specifically SDG Impact Finance, which is an initiative I support, the learnings from the conference are that in order to raise money for accelerators and new initiatives, new financial services, businesses, fund managers, the best route in order to ensure a more rapid or more robust solution is probably in the short term to partner with existing financial services businesses that are investing in impact, that are well versed in asset management, have a track record of investment, and have a number of institutional relationships for which they've raised money already.